Well, welcome again. It's lovely to see you all here and to welcome you to the biannual Sylvia Townsend Warner lecture. And I'm Peter Swab. I teach at UCL and I edit the Warner Journal at the moment. And I'd just like to start with a few thanks to various people who've enabled the occasion today. First of all, the IAS, the Institute of Advanced Studies, who are hosting us and whose room this is. And then various people from UCL Press who publish the journal and have set things up today so that there's, you probably spotted the reception to come at the back. There's a few printouts of previous versions of this occasion as well, including the talk by Maud Ellman, who we're very pleased to see is here tonight as well. And if I could also thank Amy Lynn and Sunbul Akhtar and Ian Caswell from the press for help with the reception, with quite a lot of technical bits and bobs that we'll be enjoying today in Claire's talk. And for anything else I've forgotten to say. So thank you to all of those. Most of all, thank you to Claire, who will now be introduced by the Society, the Warner Society's chair, Jan Montefiore. I just wanted to say a particular thanks to Claire, who's battled not only the elements, but a sore knee today, and who is, as Jan will explain, really the person most suited, probably in the entire world, to give the lecture today.
Good evening. Well, I am tempted to say that Claire Harman needs no introduction here, but of course that would be silly. It is my very great pleasure and honour to introduce her today to give this lecture. As you all know, Claire is an eminent biographer. She has written acclaimed lives of Fanny Burney, Robert Louis Stevenson, landmark biography of Charlotte Bronte, and a book about literary detection in Victorian England, and most recently, her biography of Catherine Mansfield, All Sorts of Lives, came out this year. She's also written fiction, which has been shortlisted for major awards, and in 2015, I'm very envious of this, her poem, The Mighty Hudson, first published in the TLS, won the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem. But, of course, we know her best as the preeminent Sylvia Townsend Warner scholar. Her publications include, first of all, the biography, not just the biography, but the biography of Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1989, which was awarded the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and is recognised as a classic. The following year, her edition of Sylvia Townsend Warner's diaries came out. She wrote the introductions for the 7 novels by Sylvia Townsend Warner, reprinted by Virago. Before that, or any of that, she edited the collected poems of Sylvia Townsend Warner for Carcanet in 1972, followed by a very much enlarged new edition of 2008. And before that, she edited for the journal PN Review a special Sylvia Townsend Warner celebration. That was in 1981. This was the first to publish a selection of Warner's poems out of her letters. And I remember it particularly because I picked up a copy of it not far from here in what is now Waterstones and brought it home. That was the first I ever heard of Sylvia Townsend Warner. You know, I couldn't put it down and became a Warner enthusiast. And for that, I have always been particularly grateful to Claire. So I look forward keenly, as I think everybody here does and everybody online, to her lecture on the voice of the heart, capture and evasiveness in Sylvia Townsend Warner's life and work. Claire.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm going to just sit down. So is this microphone working adequately? Can people hear? Good, that's great. I'll move even further forward. And Ian's going to do some twiddling. Also, I better keep an eye on There are a fair number, but not a wealth of accounts of what it was like to meet Sylvia Townsend Warner. David Garnett remembered an alarming lady with a clear and minatory voice, dark, dripping with tassels, like a black and slender barb, caparisoned for war, with jingling earrings, swinging foxtails, black silk acorn hanging from umbrella, black tasseled gloves, dog chains, key rings, tripped lightly in and speaking to me in sentences like scissors, told me, "It was you, dearest Sylvia." That was in 1927. They'd known each other for about 4 years. William Maxwell's first impression was equally bowled over. He said, "I met her for the first time when she came to the New Yorker office in the fall of 1939. She was dressed in black. Her voice had a slightly husky, intimate quality. Her conversation was so charming, it made my head swim. I didn't want to let her out of my sight, ever." Stephen Spender's first impression was slightly less complimentary. He referred to Warner just as the communist lady writer. This was in his memoir, World Within World. Said the communist lady writer in Spain who looked like and behaved like a vicar's wife presiding at a tea party given on a vicarage lawn as large as the whole of Republican Spain. Her extensory smiling mouth and her secretly superior eyes under a shovel hat made her graciously forbidding. One other first impression was by Louise Morgan, who was one of the interviewers I'll talk about in a minute. And Morgan noticed what a lot of people noted, which was Sylvia's voice. She said she sets one chuckling at once. She rarely laughs herself, however. All her expression is put into her voice, which is like a viola with harp accompaniment. Slightly precious description, but I think we get the idea about that. Of course, when you're writing a biography, you gather in all these different impressions and have to make what you can of them. You read the works, of course, and in the case of Warner, encounter very quickly that bemusing diversity and inconsistency so often remarked on, and the charm and the voice in every sense. The bravura voice and the intimate plangent one, the fantasy novels that coexist with the realist stories. She won't be categorized, she can't be. In the surviving interviews with Warner, I think you find a person who doesn't relish being the object of the sort of attention she was being asked to give, talking about her own books, explaining things, but she was willing to oblige if necessary. The interview which Louise Morgan conducted in 1930 at Sylvia's flat in Inverness Terrace, and which was published in her book Writers at Work, is very full of deflections and digressions. In fact, it was rereading that interview earlier on this year that made me think about Sylvia's evasiveness. Louise Morgan kept the interview at a fairly superficial level. What is your routine? Where do you get your ideas? That sort of thing. And Sylvia replied in kind with a light, breezy, often quite facetious sounding tone. Even a totally straightforward and practical question gets a not entirely enlightening reply. "Have you any special secret in cooking that you don't mind giving away?" asked Morgan. "One should always use butter," is what I actually find that an incredibly difficult piece of advice to follow. Also during that interview, which Morgan interestingly records, the phone keeps ringing several times. So Sylvia is distracted and she's also distracting. And Morgan says she herself has that same quality of unexpectedness. It is part of her great personal charm that she keeps her listener constantly on the alert and never by any chance gives him what he's prepared for. I think that's a very interesting observation of Sylvia, both as a person and a writer. Another interview that she did, I think it's 1971, with Francois Galix, which is republished in the journal, was about T.H. White. And Galix was obviously somebody she not only wanted to help, but with someone with whom she could talk on a mutually interesting subject. And she consequently sounds much more relaxed in that interview with him than with any of the others. The interview in 1975 that was done by Michael Schmidt and Val Warner is an incredibly interesting document. And in a minute, I'm going to play you a bit of it. It's really incredible. It's very, very indistinct, the recording. But Warner had to climb up several flights of stairs. I feel sorry for her today, to get to the flat where they were going to record. And Michael didn't know much about Sylvia's work at the time, but Val Warner was actually very well informed. And Sylvia was clearly quite surprised that Val Warner knew so much about her work. She didn't expect a young person of 1975 to have been able to even get the books. I think in this interview, a lot of you will know it has been reproduced several times. It does have a lot of information in it. It's quite extensive too. And Sylvia seems ready and willing to tackle any subject, and seems also completely in control of the proceedings. But she isn't going to say too much on any one area, which kind of jumps around quite a bit. She answers sometimes with a very pithy answer, but she doesn't kind of stay on the subject. It's quite frustrating when you're listening to it or wanting to get more out of her. She says, for instance, in that interview, that she was expelled from kindergarten for being disruptively lively and wanting to make the children laugh and play. And I think that's clearly a lifelong trait, to be amusing and lively, to keep things going socially, to entertain herself, if no one else. But there's also a feeling of how difficult it was for any of the interviewers to get past her charm to a straight answer. So I'm going to, with Ian's help, we're going to listen to, don't worry, it's only 2 minutes. It's an agitatingly bad recording. This is the CD it comes from. It says very poor quality, and they're not wrong. That CD was made some years ago from the reel-to-reel tapes that Michael gave me, but they were in such reel-to-reel tapes had so many different types. And when I was trying to get things digitized, 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of the companies involved had trouble playing some of the old tape recordings. And this is one of them. And what happens is with this one is that although the original tapes are fairly comprehensible, and I listened to them in the BBC back in about 1984, with headphones on and a special button you could sort of rest the tape. So I was able to make a transcription of the interview because I had this special equipment, which now no longer is accessible by me anyway. So this terrible recording, you will hear Sylvia's voice up front. You won't really hear Michael or Val Warner because they are so sort of indistinct. So as I say, it's just 2 minutes. It's to give you a sense not just of Sylvia's voice, at a period before those late recordings when she was much weaker in 1977 when she did the Poetry Now recordings. But in 75, she's got much more sort of energy in her voice. But also just what she's doing, she's always going into these digressions. So thank you, that's fine.
I think that I've always been interested in the supernatural social aspects. Partly reading things down to the criminal trials of Scotland. It's by far the best record of the activities of witches and witch hunters in Scotland, and written in the most beautiful style. And I enjoyed reading them. And I suppose I went on from there. Of course, I was very much influenced by old Margaret Murray, the god of the witches. She was a striking old lady, like Queen Victoria. You must speak up, I can't tell you. I suppose my novels, the Corner of the Pilgrim took me a long time to write. And that was an important book in my life. But I wrote that all through the war, at intervals, all the other horrible things I had to do. And whenever I got a moment to myself, I went on with that. I think that is my most person, and I believe after the death of John Stewart, is the next person. Though it appears to be quite important because it's written with an added degree of self-help. Would you, oh no. I couldn't possibly. I wouldn't do that to anyone. You know, I've never had any temptations for these Christians. I think partly because of the Christians I met in my childhood. Was this for a woman who was family nurse in a family that I knew. And having studied her all through one joint holiday, I said to my mother in confidence, are all Christians crossed? She replied with great justice, not all of them.
Let's stop the. Thank you, that's great, and then I'll go back to the. Super. So yes, as you can tell, that's an incredibly strange and crackly recording, but and now much harder to hear now than it was 20 years ago. But these things are just hanging on, these captures of her voice and of her, the sound, that wonderful cadence of her speech. We're sort of clinging on to these things technologically. That sort of strange satanic backwash of the recording was, I think it's because of the latest attempt to process it. You know, the back of the tape sounds like there's a baby crying, doesn't there? But anyway, it's introduced a lot of extra agitation. Anyway, so there you get that wonderful story about the Are All Christians Cross? This typical sort of diversionary tactics, possibly, and diversionary procedures. And I'd like to look today at this fondness for digression, evident throughout Warner's works. And I was wondering how much of it is temperamental, how much of it's defensive, how much self-conscious, how much artful. She was certainly someone who didn't want to be pinned down or captured, and she seldom so showed her quieter side. David Garnett again describes two quite different modes that he observed in her on an outing to the Essex marshes in the early 1920s. On the way out, she showed an extraordinary display of verbal fireworks. Ideas, epigrams, and paradoxes raced through her mind and poured from her mouth as though she were delirious. That must have been an intimidating spectacle, although on the way back, exhausted by the long walk, Sylvia, for the first time in his company, fell silent. Brilliance and shyness were alike forgotten. Our hearts were warm to each other and have remained so ever since. The person who most closely observed Sylvia and who in the spring and summer of 1930 was becoming fascinated by her, if at a distance, was of course Valentine Acton, soon to be Sylvia's lover. Valentine talked about Sylvia to their mutual acquaintance in Cholden, took her photograph surreptitiously, this is the one, of Sylvia sitting in the deck chair in Beth Carr, T.F. Poe's garden. It's the kind of thing a would-be lover would do, isn't it? Take a secret photograph. And she'd begun to dream about Sylvia too. And in Valentine's dreams, Sylvia was displaying an eager and loving look. It was catching sight of Sylvia by accident while driving down Inverness Terrace, which had moved Valentine to offer Sylvia the use of her rented cottage in Cholden, the event which led eventually to them living together. Thinking herself alone and unobserved, Sylvia had seemed to Valentine haunted and despairing. There was obviously a power in Valentine having captured this, having seen this, as well as a trigger for compassion. Sylvia did love solitude as much as company, it seems to me, and she had written a witty, truthful poem in the summer of 1929 on the occasion of her then lover, Percy Buck, being away on an extended trip to Africa. It's the absence. How happy I can be with my love away. No care comes all day. Like a dapple of clouds, the hours pass by. Time stares from the sky, but does not see me where I lie in the hay. So still do I lie. Like points of dew, the stars well in the skies. Taller the trees rise. Disshadowed, uncelled, I wander slow. My thoughts flow and flow. But whither they tend I know not, nor need to surmise. So softly I go. Till to my quiet bed I must undress. Then I say, alas, that he whom too anxious or too gay I torment all day, can never know me in my harmlessness while he is away. Too anxious or too gay, Sylvia was aware of and interested in her own self-consciousness. After having supper with her friend and publisher Charles Prentice in 1928, she wrote this in her diary. He knows me very well, I think, and perhaps I scarcely know him at all. That extreme gentleness excites me, and I find myself behaving with him as though I were alone out of doors. It's almost unnerving to be so freed of self-consciousness. What he thinks of me, I cannot imagine, because I know myself apart from my books. I do not see them as integrally part of myself. But he, I fancy, is giving the peach to Llewellyn, taking Mr. Fortune in the taxi, picking up Nellie Trim's handkerchief. Yes, I feel sure of this. That accounts for my lack of self-consciousness. As an artist, I'm not self-conscious, and when I'm with him, my mind flows as though I were my full artist self, not the naked Sylvia that wears clothes and is met by people. Suddenly I do something clumsy or idiotic, and Sylvia is in torment. But I soon forget her again. She's no more to me than the woman reflected in the mirror opposite. I think it's interesting to think about this secret, private, quiet Sylvia, as opposed to the performer, both in society and in literature. Forgetting Sylvia was hard for Sylvia to do, though her relationship with Valentine certainly stabilized things. I wouldn't go as far to say, as Terry Castle does, that Sylvia's writing lacked gravitas before she and Valentine became a couple. The fanciful and whimsical side of her temperament remained pretty active all her life. But life with Valentine encouraged Sylvia to feel freer, while being pleasurably caught, as this poem of the early 1930s, a sort of companion piece or riposte to the absence shows. I, so wary of traps, so skillful to outwit springs and pitfalls set, am caught now, perhaps. Though capture, while I'm laid so still in hold, is but the limbs' long sigh to admit how heavy freedom weighed. That sort of pleasurable capture that she was celebrating there in a poem which was clearly just directed towards Valentine, and it was not primarily for public consumption, shows the kind of state that they were in by 1931. Valentine, at that point, was actually beginning to worry that Sylvia's solitude might be something she was missing, and that that perhaps freedom hadn't weighed as heavily as she was saying in the poem. When Valentine was writing to Sylvia in January 1931, she's at Winterton and they're anticipating going to Lavenham together, with Lavenham being a place that Sylvia thought of as a kind of alone and special place in the country. Valentine said to her, "We will be very happy, of course, and how lovely to be together where you were alone. But will you regret your lost estate and wish to be solitary again? Perhaps I shall pick up scent of that outworn Sylvia and track her from out her sleep and learn what she was like. But I believe that her sleep will slide into death, and that haunted and despairing creature I saw in the street will never come back." It's a strange thing to say, isn't it? I think that idea that the sleep of the outworn Sylvia will slide into death. It makes it sound as if Sylvia herself will also be extinguished, but it's the outworn Sylvia that she thinks will never come back, but haunted and despairing creature that she saw from her car on Inverness Terrace. Self-consciousness, of course, is an issue, comes into the diary writing that Sylvia did for 50 years. And one doesn't think of it or read it as a particularly self-conscious diary, but that's because it's so artful. She understood the compositional difficulties of autobiography in a diary from the start, especially the problem of address. Who is one speaking to in a diary? A future self, current acquaintance who might be shown or steal a look at supposedly unvarnished truths about you? Posterity? Virginia Woolf's remark in her own diary, do I ever write even here for my own eye, if not for whose eye, is a very potent and interesting rumination, isn't it? Who would one ever be writing a diary to? Neither Woolf nor Warner would have imagined their journals being published, though they must have acknowledged, however detachedly, the likelihood of that happening, or of them being read. Very few people get around to destroying or even sorting out their personal papers. They just generate them and keep them. For one thing, it'd be a very time-consuming task, and for another, the one person who might want to look back at personal papers, at diaries, but doesn't, is oneself. And what you'll find there might well not square with how you now remember it, which is the gist of what Sylvia wrote to Elise Gregory in 1953. She says, I don't wonder at your mood of self-questioning if you've been typing out old journals. Of all Pandora boxes, the worst is the one keeps journals, letters, unfinished manuscripts in. I have mine too, and merely to open them in search of some specific thing is enough to send me tossed and shipwrecked into that strange, unchartable sea of time past. Sometimes I cannot even recognize the woman who did these things, knew these extraordinary forgotten people, entertained these jejune great thoughts or these absurd ambitions. And in the same letter to Elise, she made this wonderful, neat remark. She said, an old teapot used daily can tell me more of my past than anything I recorded of it. So wonderful observation. And yet, of course, Sylvia Townsend Warner uses her diary to try to do exactly that, to capture the everyday, the fugitive flavour of any particular time, a sight, a conversation, a passing thought. I mean, the old teapot might have its uses, many uses, but she is still writing her diary in this kind of knowledgeable hopelessness about being able to capture the minute. Her diaries are brilliant, but very lonely-minded, lonely-voiced. She's certainly, I think, not after the initial years intending Valentine to read them at all. It's a sort of repository, a resource and a recourse in her loneliest times. She addresses herself sometimes bitterly during the periods of sorrow with Valentine and heartbrokenly after Valentine's death. They really are some of the most affecting personal writing I've ever seen. The artificiality of the diary form, of course, trying to create the illusion that what is recorded is time passing, not time past, is something that that Sylvia was also, I think, very alert to. But when she was asked why she wasn't intending to write an autobiography, she said, because I'm too imaginative. It was a problem that she obviously thought about and wrote a very interesting piece, which has only recently been published again in the journal. She wrote it and she submitted it to the New Yorker in 1945. It's called The Difficulties of Autobiography. But it was rejected by the New Yorker and first published by the journal in 2019. It's short, about 800 or 900 words only, and seems connected very obviously with the series of childhood stories that Warner wrote in the 40s and 50s, and which were collected after her death in the book Scenes of Childhood and One Thing Leading to Another. Stories with an irrepressibly comic tone, depicting her parents as very definite characters, almost cartoonishly at times, and sort of sending up in a very benign, very funny, but tiringly jolly way sometimes. her early life. I find those stories are very heavily narrated rather than exactly fictionalized. So the anecdotes from her youth that she kind of narrates in a really layered fictional way. And it forms a sort of autobiographical fiction rather than autofiction or anything else. And it's interestingly categorized, those books of childhood, in Gian Montefiore's bibliography of Warner under memoir. But I think they flagrantly display her most flamboyant and fictionalizing tones. So this piece, The Difficulties of Autobiography, I'm going to get you. Oh no, sorry, I just forgot to show you the internet photograph. That was the, because I only got this photograph today at lunchtime, I'd forgotten it was in there. This is a picture supplied by the Dorset History Centre of Sylvia in bed. It's taken by Valentine. It's meant to be illustrating being captured. I think I've also looked. This is really the story. The Difficulties of Autobiography sets out to identify and describe the point at which Sylvia first became excited about words. It's a very appropriate place, she states, to start a writer's autobiography. So she's in the story apparently trying to begin her autobiography and do it thoroughly and truthfully. And she pins down this moment of excitement to a specific time in the autumn of 1899. She would have been 5, rising 6, when she was out with her nurse and another Harrow, the nurse of another Harrow family, and listening in a desultory way to these two women's conversations. She just depicts them as walking ahead of her. So she's got the backs of the two nurses. There's one who's slim and there's one who's chubby. There's one who's her nurse who's lovely, and the other one is ghastly. I suspect the other one of being that the cross Christian from the interview. Either she is or she's a close cousin of that. But anyway, the infant or the young Sylvia is walking along, listening to their conversation. She says they were talking about an outbreak of fire in a lunatic asylum. More of their family affairs, I suppose. They both had that kind of family. But then Sylvia's nurse utters the words, "That's the shadow of Ashlydiat." And this is the next part of the story. It says, for a moment that will last me till my dying day, everything became transfixed and transcendent. The speechless blue of the autumn sky, the road to London sloping down before us with its vista of dismantling trees, the iron bench which the town council or possibly some dead benefactor had caused to be placed just there, and which the nurses scorned to use, for to sit upon cold iron brings on you know what. The falling leaves I was scuffing with my feet, the pungent, sorrowful smell of autumn in a clay soil country of fine timber. I received the words and swallowed them and became conscious of literature. Presently, I saw a nun flash by on a bicycle. And this very strange little passage, which is an epiphany, is a description of becoming conscious of literature, but of course it involves no written text, and which also, at the date when she's recording, has no association for the child with books, since she doesn't recognize The Shadow of Ashlydiat as the title of a novel by Mrs. Henry Wood, to which her nurse is referring. She receives the mysterious words, The Shadow of Ashlydiat, and something kicks in. The walk changes in its nature. Everything became fixed and transcendent, transubstantiated, one could say, to pick up on the language of communion that runs right through the piece. It's a moment of heightened perception, and the nun flashing by on a bicycle is, it seems, an important contribution to the impression fixing so strongly in the child's mind. But then Warner goes off at quite a tangent to explain about the glimpse of the cycling nun, and we're forced from the shimmering epiphanic moment described here to some very mundane considerations. The nun turns out not to have been a nun on the road, but one in the grounds of a convent that they were passing. The convent had a cracked fence through which the children had become familiar with the sight of nuns pedaling briskly around the grounds every afternoon, floating in and out of the bushes like rooks, she says. This was not a bicycling order, Warner explains drolly, but an enclosed and contemplative one who had responded to their doctor's suggestion that they should get more exercise by purchasing and frequently using 12 machines. Warner even digresses onto the specific cause of their poor health, constipation, and introduces into the story her father as a friend of the doctor, opining that all contemplative orders are constipated. He says this, she says, as though he'd lived in dozens of them. He was a historian, she continues, and found an occasional axiom very soothing. So things are getting sillier and sillier in this story. There are so many digressions, even within this digression, onto the nature of her father's delight in an occasional axiom and him deploying it there. But at the same time, amidst all this distraction, there's an oblique sort of knitting up going on underneath, even in 800 to 900 words. There's Mrs. Henry Wood and Mrs. Humphrey Ward. There are wheels of bicycles and wheels of perambulators. There's the slim cheerfulness and the heavy nurse, whose very hair declares her religious persuasion. Sylvia receives her vocation to literature while swallowing the words, the shadow of Ashlydiat. The doctor, Ruthven, is a zealot, even though his zealotry is focused on regular evacuations, which is why he wants to get the nuns on bicycles. Sometimes the underlay of this piece is as simple as puns. The nuns, for instance, show an unenterprising spirit in their faithfulness to God. But what Warner set out to describe in this piece was something very powerful, impressions coming together and sticking together through an extra force of intense perception. It's a truly Proustian moment, but not conveyed in language that Proust would ever have used or chosen. That here, not understanding the phrase, the shadow of Ashlydiat, but she feels its power and mystery. And the nuns have to be there because they are part of the strong moment. She goes on to say, many people have assured me that this could never have taken place, that I must have dreamed or invented it. This is the cycling nuns. Just as I cannot gainsay the fact that it was the shadow of Ashlydiat which awoke me to the power of the word. I cannot recall that awakening without a flash of wheels and a sweep of black skirts crossing my mind's eye. This sort of clustering or adhesiveness is going on it's going on in the state of mind described here, is highly characteristic of Warner. Here, the impressions are shown flying inwards and sort of being sucked up and remembered. But in so much of Warner's writing, they are there to be released or unpacked at different times and at different speeds. There's this layeredness in her style, the literary echoes as well that she often employs, and all the freight, the poison that they bring with them. It seems to me the very opposite of evasiveness. It's a kind of packing in, almost like a big bang intensity. She ends the little essay, The Difficulties of Autobiography, thus. Says, unfortunately, the feeling for words is but a minor part of the business of being a writer. The sense of form is more important and harder to come by. In writing fiction, one can achieve at any rate symmetry. But in autobiography, I do not for the life of me see how one can reconcile the claims of truth and the claims of proportion. Nothing is clearer in my memory than how I first began to feel excited about words. What better beginning for an autobiography? And just look what happens next. So this is, she sent this then to Guy Lebrano at the New Yorker, who didn't want to take it. But it's a sort of sardonic experiment in actually, if you're going to write an autobiography, if you're going to really describe, say, the moment when he first became alert to literature, you're really going to have to go into all those cracks in the convent fence, the doctor, constipated nuns, the bicycles. So I've been worrying a bit about veracity in Warner, but there may have been another equally important factor at work, which is proportion. And she says there, the claims of truth and the claims of proportion, she sets them together. And here we can do no better than turn to Proust, the master of unpacking the moment and wrapping it up again. Warner's commissioned to write the first translation of Proust's Contre Saint-Beuve, when it was published in 1954, was a very important commission for her. Chateau Windus wanted an English translation as soon as possible after the first French translation in 1954, and they approached Sylvia. It did take her a couple of years. She was working on it from January 1955 to April 1956, and it was only published in 1958. But this was a text which really made a great impression on the literary world, not published in Proust's lifetime. To her, it was important and absorbing and interestingly related to all the issues to do with autobiography and biography, and it certainly does relate to how she approached her biography of T.H. White 10 years later. Proust, as many of you will know in that book, it's a series of essays, which is sort of like a dry run in some respects for à la recherche de temps perdu. And Proust operates as, it really is like a sort of autofiction. He appears in the essays as Marcel Proust, and he writes really, he's got a great interest in the hybridity of the thing he's writing. He's observing himself, he's introducing some of the characters who are then later in the novel, but he's also taking a long aim at Saint-Beuve, the critic Saint-Beuve, whose method, the method of Saint-Beuve, is one that Proust profoundly disagrees with. And Proust sort of characterizes the method of Saint-Beuve, the literary critic, as being, because Saint-Beuve wrote a weekly article in the Causerie de Lundi, and he described meeting writers. He described writers through their, basically their physical appearance and their social persons. By writing against Saint-Beuve, and of course Sylvia's title isn't literal, it's more of a deflected title. She says, by way of Saint-Beuve, rather than contre Saint-Beuve. But the celebrated method, which in her translation of Proust, she says, consists, if you would understand a poet or writer, in greedily catechizing those who knew him, who saw quite a lot of him, who can tell us how he conducted himself in regard to women, etc. Precisely, that is, at every point where the poet's true self is not involved. So in Sylvia's translation of parts of the method of Saint-Beuve, Proust says, at no time does Saint-Beuve seem to have understood that there's something special about creative writing, and that this makes it different in kind from what busies other men, and at other times, busies writers. He drew no dividing line between the state of being engaged in a piece of writing and the state when in solitude, stopping our ears against those phrases which belong to others as much as to us, and which we make use of in our consideration of things whenever we are not truly ourselves. Even though we may be alone, we confront ourselves and try to catch the true voice of the heart, and to write down that and not small talk. The implication that there's something more superficial and empty, this is still Proust, in a writer's authorship, something deeper and more contemplative in his private life, is due to nothing else than the special pleading of necessity. In fact, it is the secretion of one's innermost life, written in solitude and for oneself alone, that one gives to the public. What one bestows on private life, in conversation that is, however refined it may be, or in those drawing room essays, whittled down to suit a particular circle, and scarcely more than conversation and finish, is the project of quite superficial self, not the innermost one, which one can only recover by putting aside the world and the self that frequents the world. That innermost self which has waited while one is in company, which one feels certain is the only real self, and which artists, and they only, end by living for. I've always actually found this a very powerful passage, ever since I first read it years ago. And I love that idea of you meet the, Théophile Gautier or Gerard de Nerval at a cocktail party. If you're Saint-Beuve, you go away and write it up as, what it was like to be with Théo and Gerard. But Proust is saying that the only way really to encounter these people, even if you see them in public, is to read their works, because the works sort of leap over the person and the personal life and circumstances, and that is the only conduit. And that is also what the writer should or does wish to happen, to be read rather than reported on. So just as Proust was evolving his own aesthetic through this traction and his feelings against Saint-Beuve, Sylvia, I think, evolved her aesthetic through the prism of Proust. And as I was saying, the White biography does show her thoughtfulness about how do you represent the subject of biography, how do you, what's the purpose of the biography, and how truthful can it be. The invitation to write the biography of T.H. White came just months after his sudden death in 1964, and was at the initiative of friends, including David Garnett, who were trying to stop White's agent David Harman taking charge of the project himself. Warner had read none of White's books except his poems, and she felt very hesitant, I think one would say, about the idea of writing a biography at all. But in a letter to William Maxwell in 1967, she explained how the oddness of the request became part of its appeal. Also, how being amongst White's things in his house in Alderney tipped her towards a feeling of human obligation towards the dead stranger. His clothes were on hangers, she wrote to Maxwell. His sewing basket with an unfinished hawkwood, his litter of fishing flies, his books, his awful ornaments presented by his hoi polloi friends, his vulgar toys bought at the Cherbourg fairs, his neat rows of books about flagellation. Everything was there, defenceless as a corpse. And so was he, morose, suspicious, intensely watchful, and determined to despair. So when we think of the first impressions of Sylvia, this is her first impression of White, who was of course dead by that point, but it's a very powerful feeling that she gets through being in amongst his possessions in his house in Alderney. The friends who'd wanted her to write it thought her a good choice because of her broad-mindedness and her sympathetic imagination, and they were of course right. But there's no doubt that White and Sylvia would not have got on at all in life. White's individualist politics, his fear of women, his thoroughgoing approach to tax evasion, and even his awful art would have nipped in the bud any sort of friendship, and the flagellation library was hardly going to be a mutual interest. And yet, Warner did end up loving him, at least loving the unpeeled him of her private understanding, gained through his books, letters, and diaries. When she started writing the book, she was fascinated by his personality and also by the sort of predicament of Tim, and the horror of his loneliness and his depressing life. But as she started reading his works, she was interested, but she was never really much grabbed by his works, which was a pity. There were one or two that she admired, but on the whole, she found his works disappointing. But the private writing that she had access to, and also his autobiographical writing, she wanted to use wherever possible. And so her biography had a sort of aspect of being a bit in the way of a Victorian Lives and Letters, presenting some of the documents that the public haven't seen yet, and writing a narrative that links them. I mean, it wasn't as extreme as the actual Victorian Lives and Letters model, but it certainly had something of that in it. But of course, White was a concealer, and Warner wasn't. Warner was a celebratory, defiant, in plain sight, private lesbian. And any elements of evasiveness you find in her work never have anything to do with avoidance or unwillingness to be explicit on moral grounds. She was master of the eloquent silence and clung to her father's maxim, never apologize, never explain. About her politics and her sexuality, she felt she had nothing to apologize for. With Warner, fiction was often her way of expressing the plainest truths, which are never concealed in her work, although they might just appear in glimpses and be all the stronger for it. She establishes a sort of status quo, and then you only realize after the event that the context is rather specific. There are obviously, as you all know, homosexual themes in Mr. Fortune's Maggot, Some Will Show, The Flint Anchor, many of the stories. And in fiction, I think she felt she could say whatever she liked. The same effect is of this being able to speak plain truth is achieved in the very interesting title story of Winter in the Air, which many of them will know is a wonderful story and wonderful collection. At the end of the story, when an abandoned wife has returned to London, and is living in the sort of same way that she did before her marriage, which is now over. She's attempting to write a thank you letter to her ex. She's being very polite. She's trying to be good about it. And she gets stuck in the middle of the thank you letter, or not, just a letter of making contact with him. And she says, "I hope." And then she doesn't know what she hopes. While she's trying to finish her awkward letter, exactly what she would like to say comes to mind, which is part of the speech by Hermione at the end of Winter's Tale. So in her mind, she's saying, "To me can life be no commodity. The crown and comfort of my life, your favour, I do give lost, for I do feel it gone, yet know not how it went." So those are the perfect words for this character's situation. But then she can't say that. She has to just resort to some absolutely conventional wording. She says, "In real life, one cannot write so plainly the plain truth. It would look theatrical." But of course, in the story, she's in a fiction, and Warner is able to give us both what she would like to have said, and then what she does end up saying. With regard to White, Warner wasn't going to dodge or fudge any of the issues raised, and there were a lot of what we think of as delicate, sensitive issues. She aimed to be as open as possible about his nature, while withholding details which were both sensational and, in her view, somewhat beside the point. When she was already halfway through the book, she was given access to the diaries that White had kept under lock and key, and in which he wrote obsessively about his paedophilic urges and his sadism. Reading them was like going deeper into dungeons, she told her own diary, and yet she saw the pathos in them, even more than the behaviours. So puny, in fact, she said, so overwhelming and feeble. She'd already guessed at those dungeons. When details of the Moors murders were made public in the spring of 1966, she'd noted in her diary that it was exactly that sort of thing that waited round every corner for White. That's before she'd read the flagellation diaries. In her diary, she said, "This I must both grasp and state." It was a part of his character, his nature, that she wanted to grasp and state, but not necessarily grasp or state specific sins or crimes or deviations. In the finished book, the subject of White's sadism and its origins turns up again and again, but without explicit references to his fantasies. And she said, in her own diary again, "There's a kind of ill manners about such discussions with strangers." And that is what the printed page means. I think it's a very interesting junction, because she's certainly she's not an evasive person. She's not a moralizing person. She's somebody whose manners and whose manner forbids her from making an over-sensational case against White. She wants to get to the heart of them, which she does brilliantly. There were compromises with that book that had to be made for reasons of prudence rather than principle. There's a last-minute request from the publishers, Kate, to take White's word for it that there'd been no sodomy in an affair with an underage boy she calls Zed in the book. And this is a point that did worry her, because it wasn't that she wanted to expose him or not, but she said White said there was no sodomy, but how am I to substantiate this? Because she couldn't actually prove it, she couldn't substantiate it. It was one of those elements in when you're researching a biography that the jury is out. To Garnett, she wished she could use White's torment over Zed fully, but said to him, "It's a sad reflection that after all these years, intelligent people like ourselves have been illuminating English society. It is still totally impossible to be honest." Of course, this was the year in which homosexuality was decriminalized. She was being very forthright about White's sexuality, much to his agent's annoyance. She'd faced this as well, this impossibility of being honest in her own work. Ian Parsons, her publisher, her editor at Chatham Linders, had some last-minute editorial anxieties about the Flint Anchor. he wanted to take out the whole of the conversation with the fisherman Crusoe, in which Crusoe declares his love for Thomas Kettle. And this is, it's slightly surprising to Thomas Kettle when Crusoe comes out to him, but it's worked into the fabric of the novel. So, you know, without any eyelids being batted, it's so completely part of the book. It's an essential part of the book, but it's certainly not sensationalized. It just suddenly reveals to us the context of how the fishing community lived and how they, you know, what their moral sort of feelings were, and what the conventions were then too. And so really it would be awful and absurd to take this passage out. She fought for it and it stayed in. But when the correspondence was going to and fro with Ian Parsons, who was anxious about the book being perceived as a gay book in 1954, she writes she says, all this howdy-do about homosexuality, you know, why would people be fussing about it? It's just there. It's a historical novel anyway, but it's also there in the fabric. And why draw attention to it by trying to remove it? So she was, as I say, she was open about White's nature, and she was withholding about some of the details. But talking to Francois Gallix in that very, I think, very relaxed and revealing interview, she mentioned that the character called Puck, who was a woman who was actually in love with White in the last years, she said it was very sad because although she, Puck, could have told me a great deal as a biographer, she just could not unclench herself. She was in such a state of hatred and spite. People can talk out of their hatred and be very reliable, but you never get a reliable verdict from spite. And the friends she'd met, White's friends in Alderney, which was going around collecting information biographically, were of very mixed and sometimes dubious usefulness. She said they were almost all tipsy and they were all genial, and I did not feel that except for Carol Walton, I was getting very much out of anyone. So she went around, she did meet White's friends. She wanted to know about him socially. She wanted to see him reflected in friends, but they didn't really give her information that was particularly personal. That came from her own connection with the diaries and her own communion with White himself. She did feel that connection, but it didn't stop her being critical of him. There are barbs in the text, that kind of jabs in the text about him, and off-record remarks and letters to friends. And she also felt that there was an essential unknowability. There was a limit to what her personality and her lack of actual congeniality with White, what that would mean. To Gallix, she said, sometimes I feel I know him very well indeed, but then I remember all I know is my own White. I am just another of the people who have their own White. And then she said, I never felt I'd come to the end of it. This was about 10 years after the book. So she's carrying on thinking about him, and also knows that her portrait of him, which was as good as she could do, was also partial, partisan, and her own note. I'm just going to end with talking a bit about researching Sylvia as a biographical subject itself. I wonder if I forgot Leonard's pictures. Oh, no, that's a picture of itself. I'm just going to end on that picture because it's a nice one and came very crisply from the history section. With Warner, with her wit, vitality, and as Terry Castle has said, her ineffable self-possession is in many ways an intimidating subject of biography. And when I set out to gather that sort of information, I had little idea how long it would take or how complex it would be, as well as delightful and pleasurable and educational and nurturing and exciting. The chronology of Warner's life, when I first started to research which was actually for that peer review piece that Jan was mentioning, so it's about 1980. The chronology was unclear, and there's a huge amount of data about herself and her family to actually find out, you know, who were her family members, her family tree, where did they come from? There was detective work to be done, there were connections to be made, there were books to track down by Warner, which was no easy task at that date. And then read, obviously, manuscripts published and unpublished to decipher, transcribe, and make sense of. Actually reading through the notebooks which her diaries are in took me 2 years the first time through, because the handwriting is beautiful, but it wasn't easy, and I was reading it on microfilm, which was arduous. There were friends to meet and from whom to learn, of course. There was information to report to the world, as well as a portrait to be painted. There's a kind of, you know, the basic core of information to be established. But I was always acutely aware that part of it, my personal judgment of her, was also going to be subjective and partisan, and people would always have their own morals. My basic view of her hasn't changed a bit in 30 years, but the steady accumulation of extra information about her life and works, and that of Valentine, and the really significant growth in Warner studies, as well as her readership generally, has been a source of enormous interest, pleasure, and pride. I wouldn't want to rewrite my 1989 book, but I would very much like to augment it with all the extra material I've come across in those years. I'd like to do some diversions and have some second thoughts and or third thoughts, many of them. In fact, a few years ago, King's London suggested that we could do a digitized version of my book with like super illustrated, you know, with all these extra bits of material which would just surround the book, but not interfere with that first version, which I would like. I would never want to rewrite it. I just want it to be as it is. It's a thing of 1989. It's a thing of the past, but there is much more that I could say about all sorts of things she'd wanted. And meanwhile, she's always there to be met and re-met in her works, where she's ready, as she said of Catherine Mansfield, to project herself across time and space, to capture and captivate more than you'd expect, which is what all great literature succeeds in doing.
Well, what can I say but thank you? We have been most privileged to hear that. That was a wonderful lecture by a biographer, about a biographer. Loads and loads to think about. And I have questions myself, but self-denying audience. Well, not so much questions as responses. So, perhaps I will begin with my own. It was just a sort of gloss that when you, that sort of wonderful extract from the difficulties with autobiography. And I was reminded of a letter that she wrote to Paul Noddoff, who seems to have been creatively very, very close to her. And I think actually not long after the crisis with Valentine, she writes to him, it is as you say, we must meet together at that lonely, desperate place where we can tell each other the deepest, the impersonal secrets of the heart. Haunted by that, I can't connect it with what you've been saying.
And there's also a letter to Leonard Bacon, which I couldn't work in, which is a wonderful letter. She never met Leonard Bacon, the American writer. And when he died, she said, "I've lost a confidant, a person to whom I could write quite freely, without reservations, without considerations, without any dross of personal circumstances." It's the same sort of idea, isn't it? And she says, "I recollect in one of his letters, his simile of people meeting at a masked ball, who could speak with perfect intimacy and transgress nothing that should not be transgressed." And there is a huge freedom in that.
So, yes.
It's falling over my crutch.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. And if I may ask, not directly related to the topic, but obviously related to Sylvia, about your editing choices when publishing the diaries. Or how did you choose what to include, or rather even what to exclude? Because specifically, I'm thinking about the entries for when she goes to Paris, and they are so delightful. And I was wondering why didn't you include those?
Well, partly because of space, and when you get into a sort of mindset, you're choosing particular things. And I was aiming for entries about her writing. It's not a diary that's terribly revealing about creative processes, but it does record progress of in writing such and such. I put in a lot about the relationship with Valentine. I tended to keep the cats a little bit on those because there's a great deal about cats. Perfectly interesting, but it thought it was going to kind of overbalance it. But yes, it is very, very difficult. There's also with I developed this thing where I put the complete entries out of the italicized number and the incomplete ones didn't, just so that it was quite clear how many of the entries in the diary were actually quite short. And then suddenly you're a bit along third. But yes, obviously I was able to do a larger edition, and initially completely edited, just like the letters. I mean, my goodness, there's something that's the world's crying out for, is a scholarly edition of the letters, and it'd be massive. I mean, William Maxwell's book is fantastic. So, I think you see these early trawlings through the various modern forms as non-scholarly, obviously, when it's not a scholarly edition, and reading editions. I think I think I covered all the but clearly everybody's going to have their own favourite bits that maybe. But if you've been lucky enough to go and read the diaries, that's excellent. I know many more people have been and read them subsequently. Mrs. Valentine's story, so huge amounts of correspondences to people. I'm not quite sure where the letters from Valentine to Elise Gregory got to, and I haven't been down to the museums to the history centre. But I was lent them. This is one of those cranky things when somebody's just quite freshly dead and papers are still in private possession. Rosemary Manning, who was the person who was Elise Gregory's executrix, had been left this great big bunch of letters from Valentine, and she said, "Did I want to read them?" So yes, please. And she posted them to my house in Childerview in a great big, like hadder bag, reused several times. And she didn't tell me, because this was obviously way before email, so she didn't send no, I've sent this stuff. So the package arrived and was in my coal bunker for some time because the postman had put it in the coal bunker. And it was only when the Argo had to get lit up that I went to the coal bunker and I thought, what is this? And it was Valentine's letters to Elise Gregory. And so I was terribly worried. Read through them, and Rosemary allowed me to photocopy the ones that, if I wanted to, I didn't know what I wanted to use from them, but I was allowed to photocopy the letters. I couldn't afford to photocopy all of them, but I photocopied a big wad job and sent in the originals back. And I don't know, Rosemary Manning's executrix was the woman down the lane in Dorset. I don't know what she then did with those letters. And whether they may be in Dorset, but if they're not, if they've been, destroyed or whatever, or got lost, or in somebody's attic, I have some photocopies of some of them with the highlighter pen marking. There are all these sources that haven't been gathered together. Certainly Sylvia's letters, I would so love to see them. I think she was just such better writer. Obviously, she's a delightful better writer. I think we're on the verge of this era of Scotland editions, so I can sort of feel them coming around the corner. Because there's so much, not these figures of your journal and there's so much interest in that level, postgraduate level, and really clever people to the masters.
Maybe this is part of her diversionary tactics, but I found it in working on her that it's very frustrating that she says so little about her own writing practice or anybody else's. I mean, that there seems to be very, very little on, what is Sylvia Townsend Warner's view of the novel? I mean, what does she think it is, or what should it be doing? I mean, all those kinds of questions, you just have to kind of guess at, don't you? But I was wondering if you knew of more material of that kind that might ultimately be accessible.
I'm afraid I don't know because okay. I don't know of any particular sort of stashes apart from I was saying things like the Valentine letters. When I saw the Warner material, it's donkeys years ago, it was all up in a little attic room, which was locked. It was quite eccentric, the whole thing. You had to crawl over Elizabeth Muntz's sculptures to get to it, because nobody knew where to put Elizabeth Muntz's sculptures. And, and the Warner archive being put into the room and then was being, the first time I saw it, it was just in boxes. And that was much easier because I'd go through boxes and there'd just be, photographs and everything, all just in a big mess. But at least I could see things in a box. About 3 years later, a strange sort of system putting everything into an envelope. So one photograph would then be in an envelope, and it was very arduous. It wasn't catalogued, it was just enveloped. But I mean, I didn't have all the time in the world to go through all the notebooks. So then there'll be lots of other things. And there are things I do remember having read that I now can't locate. There was an unfinished story about a girl stuck in the snow, which it was a wonderful story. And there were also, sometimes photographs, things that one has just captured them in one's memory, and they must be there somewhere. It's just I don't know quite where. There are almost sometimes when I go to towns with the university library and I've got time on my hands, I'll go and just look at their catalogues and see there's so many little stashes of Warner letters around the place. And as I say, I think if that was drawn together, it would just be astonishing. And then she does in her letters actually sometimes write quite pointedly about practice. In the diaries, she doesn't do that, you're right. And it is frustrating just to know that she got to page 120 of writing, the flint anchor. Although she's interested, that excites her. She wants to, and she's a very quick writer too, really, when she gets the bit between her teeth. She, works hard, and she must have been able to concentrate very hard. Part of that vitality that everybody noted, and which Antonia Troutmansdorff, said that when Sylvia was a very old lady, she would wake up basically speaking. There's no sort of dragging in out of consciousness. And she would fall asleep very quickly too. There was this kind of engine that her mind was very, very active. But no, well, in fact, rather than hearing about there being papers that are available, what I tend to hear about it is people having destroyed them or lost them. Yeah, so that's, but maybe some nice young energetic people will discover some stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, just partly responding to Maud's question, I think one of the places Sylvia does write more about creative processes and their ideas of it is to Paul Nordoff. I think partly, they were very close friends, and I think he's being a composer and her being a novelist. Maybe sort of they had an agreement that they do that, and she also doesn't mind sort of saying which of her things she thinks are very good to Nordoff, where usually she's she's very modest in the Edwardian English kind of way. I got one little question really, which was about your title, Claire, about capture and evasiveness. And I was just thinking that in a way, one antonym for evasiveness would be candor. And I was interested in capture and maybe some of the thoughts you'd had about that, were the things that Sylvia feared she was captured by or might be captured by.
Well, yes, that's what I was hoping to transmit, was this actually wanting not to be captured necessarily, wanting to be free, to be unself-conscious, but that sort of social self was a bit of a prison to her too. But also she clearly, I mean, you can even hear it in her voice in that little crackly, agitating recording. She did have a lot of energy, and she wanted to keep, if she was talking to somebody, she wanted to keep talking, and she had lots of ideas and she would express them. So she sends herself up sometimes as being kind of oppressively anxious and gay, but she, I think it really was the case. I think she must have been quite exhausting at times to be with, and exhausting to be herself, at some level.
You have a further question? I think that then it just is. What is to do is to thank you once again, Claire. Absolutely superb. You have done something. I'm proud.
Thanks so much.
Really. Thank you very much.